This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Polity, John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Jeffrey B., Gabby, Helen M., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, Jeanette, DS, Jake B., CDV, Ali, V!, Mary Beth R., Ida B., Eric N., Tana, May, and Gold_81. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there's so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm Breege Burke. Now, this week we are going to be doing a podcast that was requested quite a while ago. I want to say it was probably requested far back as 2021, when I had done some on Tlazolteotl. I had done a podcast on her, and I do feel like this particular Aztec goddess that we're going to do today came up around that time. Now, I'm not an expert in the Aztec pantheons. I know some, maybe enough to be dangerous. I don't know, but I know a little bit about it, and from what I do know. There certainly is this very different view of life and death in the Aztec and even probably in the Mayan societies in terms of the way that they view things. And you can go back to those podcasts to hear more about my conclusions about those and what and about the more of the cosmogony that we have of the Aztec people, where the sun is quite central, and actually a lot of the planets and stars, or at least certain aspects of the stars, may actually be considered destructive and forces that needed to be protected against. So we definitely see a very strong agricultural element to the society. We definitely see a lot placed around the primacy of the earth and the Earth Mother in her various forms, and of course also around ideas of death. Now, the deity that we are going to be talking about today is called Tlazolteotl, and she is a goddess. This is a really interesting list. She is a goddess of sexual impurity, sinful behavior. Let's see what the other things are. Okay, here's the master list. Sexuality, vice, purification, steam baths, lust, filth, patroness of adulterers, and she's also the one who pardons sins. She is actually a goddess where there is a confession and there is penance to her. So what we're looking at is a goddess who is considered to be both the polluter and the one who purifies one from pollution. And this is really very interesting. So we're going to be talking a lot, literally in this podcast, about holy shit. This is a way to conceive it. And this was a way of discussing it from a certain article that I've been looking at by Cecilia Klein about Teoquitla, who has to do with gold or precious metals, and how it's referred to as divine excrement. So there's a tremendous amount of symbolism that those of you who have some familiarity with Earth Mother religions, or even just with alchemy or with things like that, we're already seeing where this potentially could be going here. But I think where we want to start in this podcast is I want to talk about Tlazolteotl, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the description of her, who she is as a goddess, how she was understood. And then I want to get into her symbolism and what this means about. This is an aspect of the feminine in particular that I've mentioned, I know, in passing in different places before, but this really gets into the idea of the earth as a place of filth, because the name actually does mean filth. The goddess of dirt, or the goddess of filth, is literally what this name means. So. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Let's start with talking about who she is. She's also known as, and I'm not going to try to read the Aztec names. I have enough trouble saying Tlazolteotl, so I'm not going to, you'll have to forgive me for skipping over some of them or just explaining their associations. There are certainly references that you can find, on the internet, starting from Wikipedia, but there's a lot of other places where you can actually see these names for yourself. I just don't want to get myself bogged down too much in that and not focused enough on the actual material. So she's often known as she who eats sin, sometimes called the goddess of death caused by lust, and she's also known as the deity of cotton. And this connects her to, she has 4 sisters that are talked about. It says that they are known in 4 guises associated with different stages of life. This is from Britannica. As a young woman, she was a carefree temptress. In her second form, she was the destructive goddess of gambling and uncertainty. In her middle age, she was the great goddess able to absorb human sin. In her final manifestation, she was a destructive and terrifying hag preying upon youths. Tlazolteotl was thought to provoke both lust and lustful behavior, but she could also grant absolution to those who had so sinned. Now, this is interesting because I don't know that this, I think the word sin tends to be overused. I guess that's just a concept that we tend to understand in the West. That said, there definitely is the idea that Tlazolteotl had priests, and the function of these priests were to hear confessions and to be able to purify people from their sinful acts, their lewd acts of different types. However, this purification could only be done once in your lifetime, so frequently it was done by elderly people who were getting close to death, and perhaps were not so inclined to be engaged in debauchery of various sorts. So she was somebody who both was connected with that lustful behavior that one has, the way in which one's societal controls are unleashed, both in terms of sexual behavior. As I said, she's the patroness of adulterers, and she's also connected to all other kinds of debauchery, something that we might have thought of in, say, Greek myth or Roman myth as the bacchanal, right? Like somebody who is who engages in very polluted behavior. And she's also associated with the eating of excrement, okay? And we're gonna talk about why that is. Okay. She became best known for her capacity to cleanse such sins during confessionals conducted by her priests. Thus, although she could, in one form, inspire debauched behavior, she could also forgive it and remove corruption from the world. She was portrayed in an elaborate headdress of raw cotton, and in some representations wearing the skin of a sacrificial victim, or in a costume that featured symbols of the moon. Yes, and the moon seems to be very much associated with this debauched behavior. Okay, some other associations that she has. There's, and I'm not sure if you say this, tracinas or traquinas, but there are these are 13-day periods in the Mayan calendar, which is 260 days, and she is the 13th one, and she is associated with the sign of the jaguar in her imagery and on this particular calendar. Now, what is said is that, now this was another people in Mexico, and again, I'm not sure if I'm saying the name right, Aztec, I think is how it's said. I could be wrong, but this is a Mexican group. Basically, it's a tribe that lived in Mexico, and it is said that Tlazolteotl that the Aztecs took the attributes of this Mexican mother goddess and applied them to Tlazolteotl. That historically, that's where the association comes from. Now, in what we might think of as in that section of the world, okay, what we think of as South America, or we think about Mesoamerica, or Mexico South, and even some of the islands that are connected in the Caribbean, we definitely have these ideas of deities who are particularly associated not only with lust, but similarly with filth. If you consider Pambagira's name, at least one of her names, is kind of like the Mary of garbage. There's this idea that there is this goddess that is associated with things that we consider to be debauched and filthy. And I just think it's interesting that Tlazolteotl is actually connected to both the pollution and the remedy for the pollution. She's both at the same time. So while she has to do with this kind of what we would think of as maybe this gross or filthy or disgusting behavior, or very immoral behavior, she also is the way through. So I want to talk about how that's going to work. So, okay, let me just back up. Let me think about this whole concept. Now, when we talk about earth goddesses and earth mothers, one of the concepts that I've talked about is the way in which the feminine is conceived of as being connected to the earth. Now, what are our associations with earth? Well, positively, we tend to associate the earth with generation, nourishment. As a mother, we might think of the earth as nurturing us, providing for us food, water, things for us so that we might live and survive on the earth. And obviously, sex and sexuality, in addition to the pleasure aspect of sex and sexuality, obviously it has to do with reproduction. There has been this kind of traditional, connection between the two. And in modern times, maybe we don't necessarily always think of sex as being connected to reproduction. But certainly, it's undeniable that is always a possible outcome of sexual union, right? That one could do that. Tlazolteotl is also associated very much with things like STDs, sexually transmitted disease, which of course are a concern for the community because the STDs can get in the way of one's, if one wants to bear children and have a family and be free of disease. So there's obviously a connection here to disease. So now we're looking at the aspect of the earth that has to do with filth. Think about it. If you were a kid going out in the yard and playing and you were running around in the mud, yeah, my mother would get so annoyed. It's just kind of like practically wanted to strip you before you took you into the house, and then you had to be shoved straight in the bath. We're a culture that's very, very concerned with purity and hygiene. And one of the reasons I find Tlazolteotl so interesting, because also like Matangi, I'm thinking of Matangi in the Hindu. She is one of the Mahavidyas who's associated with filth and pollution, and whose offerings involve leftover food and things like that, just with menstrual blood. Another aspect of the earth that people consider to be unclean or filthy. And when we're in a culture that's very much obsessed with hygiene, then we may look at these kinds of things as why would anybody consider anything divine about this? It seems like the most profane thing. And that comes from a view that says that what is celestial or heavenly is somehow pure, and what's of earth, it's not only dense and heavy, but it's filthy and impure. And so when you have a culture that is obsessed with purity, even if you're not obsessed with spiritual purity, see how many people are obsessed with, say, organic ways of eating, or people who might be germaphobes, right? They have to have the hand sanitizer nearby. Certainly, we were all into the habit of, extraordinary cleanliness during COVID and during things like that, so to avoid the spread of disease. And of course, that's the most practical reason for it. Disease causes illness, can cause death, or can cause other terrible things to happen when we become sick. Death isn't always the necessary outcome. But a lot of times, we have these kinds of rituals and things. It's a matter of avoiding the, what we think of as the avoiding impurities so that we live longer, that our communities are cleaner, and so on and so forth. But when we extend this idea of purity beyond what we would think of as normal hygiene, then it can get into something else. As I've mentioned in my rants against purity in the past, then we can get into things about spiritual purity, or who's more pure than somebody else. That even the whole idea of sin. I remember what was the metaphor that they used in Catholic school? The clean milk bottle of your soul. The idea is that, you might get stains on the clean milk bottle of your soul. In other words, you're regarded as stained or filthy in some way. You also will see this idea, and then also we'll see this idea in connection to ethnicity, because people start to associate brownness or darker colors in skin and so forth as associated with filth. Because think about it, if you go out and you roll around in the mud, you're probably going to have brown coating on your skin of some kind, or blackish. And so there's this association of that. And by the way, I'm not saying that's a true associate, but that people will, when I talk about people having unconscious associations. And, you have to think about the fact that colonialism tends to be this idea of white people who are the pure people, right? They're the people of light, right? This darkness and this filth has to do with people who are somehow lower or lesser, in that way of thinking and in the colonial way of thinking. So if you're going to deconstruct that, one of the things you have to go back to is not only our associations with darkness and light, but our associations with purity and filth. Right. Now, Dr. Kate Kinsbury has done a number of, she's written a number of things as an anthropologist on the Santa Muerte. And one of the things that stands out in her work is she talks about the non-dualistic belief systems, certainly connected to Santa Muerte, but she's certainly talking about Mexican indigenous populations. And this lack of division, this lack of strict division between life and death. Okay, so the Santa Muerte is a saint. She's the Holy Death, but she's also a representation of life, and she is often the one who can be the giver of life and the one who brings justice to those who have been harmed or who have been wronged. There's not a duality there between whether she's a good saint or a bad saint. She's just there to help in the sphere of human experience. A lot of times it's particularly for women, although there are men, obviously, also who are devotees. And yes, I know she's had associations with drug cartels and stuff, but we can get too over-focused on that, and that's not really what the essence is of her. She basically is one who helps people who are, a lot of times people who are desperate and don't have anywhere else to turn. And you see a lot of that with a lot of these kinds of deities. Now, with Tlazolteotl, this is not the same kind of deity as Santa Muerte, but the idea that filth is somehow holy definitely plays into this idea of non-dualism. We're not separating between what is pure and impure. We're not trying to define as what's holy versus what's not holy. All of it is holy in its own way. And that certainly, okay, just speaking as somebody who has a tantric worldview, that is certainly also the view of Tantra, that every aspect of our life is holy. And if we think about alchemy, what is alchemy? We make gold out of shit, basically. This is how you, out of the manure, out of the excrement of the earth, you are able to, that's where treasure comes from, right? There's this idea that this is the raw material. And when we talk about it in psychology and we talk about it in terms of our consciousness, it's about the way in which, I was talking a little bit about this today on one of my morning live streams, that which wounds us, that which seems to be our quote unquote sin or our flaw, may actually be the root for being able to bring about the gold that is in us. And we talk about it in a lot of ways, the idea of transforming what is apparently waste or apparently negative into something that is like precious to us, that is something that helps illuminate what you might think of as the best part of us. So in talking about this, there was an article, I like to do some academic research on this. And there's this wonderful article, as I mentioned earlier, by Cecilia Klein about Teoquitla called Divine Excrement, The Significance of Holy Shit in Ancient Mexico. And that's literally what the article title is. And this is from, let me see if I can see the journal it's from. I took it from JSTOR, and I want to say it's from the Art Journal, actually, because what she's doing is she is looking at different images of Tlazolteotl and some of the other connected deities in terms of this concept. So I'm going to actually start to read through her article, and I'm going to stop, obviously. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read through and I'm going to do some commentary, because I think it helps solidify the themes that we're talking about with this particular deity. So she starts by saying, in 1984, the American folklorist Alan Dundas published a provocative analysis of German folk sayings about excrement. The book's title, Life is Like a Chicken Coop Ladder, exemplifies the consistently negative role played by anal excretions in the lore that he collected. For it derives from a popular German expression, life is like a chicken, i.e. coop, ladder, short and shitty. That word, beschissen, or shitty here, is a metaphor for the hardships and unpleasant trivia that obstruct our rise to success and happiness, is made clear in another version of the same expression. Life is like a chicken coop ladder. A person can't get ahead because of all the shit in one's way. Okay. Wonder if I'm going to get censored by this on YouTube for the use of this word, but it is the word, okay? The use of dung to signify that which is bad or undesirable is widespread in Euro-American world and dates back to the entrenchment of Christianity. In large part, however, such symbolism is confined, as in Germany, to the realm of popular as opposed to elite culture. In the area of institutionalized religion, in particular, excrement, like sex, has been traditionally taboo. When mention of it does surface in Christian discourse, it predictably signifies the opposite of sacred. Dante, for example, vividly describes the flatterers he encounters in the eighth circle of hell as people dipped in excrement that seems to have flowed from human privies. In Western culture, today's holy shit functions as an exclamation of surprise or dismay, precisely because it has no reference beyond itself. Its power as profanity derives from the paradox embedded in it. For us, excrement is never divine. Right, and that's why the feminine is often not conceived of as divine. Because let's think about the sexual act, okay? A lot of times we tend to romanticize sex and the sexual act. We think that sex is, we talk about it, you see images of it or in film or different things. There's kind of this beautiful or beautifully, wonderfully erotic and sensual and romantic and full of all these beautiful sensations, which, sex can be all that. But really, what is the reality of sex? The reality of sex is that it's quite dirty. It is dirty. It can be very dirty. Typically, it's not as romantic as people would like to imply. And all of the things that are around sex and childbirth and so forth, like menstruation, for example. Even in childbirth, a woman can be giving birth and crapping herself at the same time. Everything that's associated with that part of the body is regarded as something unclean. So it's almost like it's connected to the earth, and it's connected to the earth in the way of thinking about it in terms of disease or infection. Certainly, we see rituals. There were a lot of Semitic rituals around women who had to stay away from the tribe, or stay, or had certain rituals they had to undergo when they had their monthly period, because they were unclean and could not be part of the community. And think about all of the curse words that we have. All of the curse words that we have are either, and I'm not the first person to say this, I think the first person who ever kind of drew this to my attention was the astrologer April Shaley. She had said, all of our curse words have to do either with sex or defecation or urination. They all have to do with that. When we talk about it, it always has something to do with that part of the body, and that's when we're cursing or insulting somebody. Okay? We have this association with it. The idea that anything about that there would be anything holy about it. We try to treat childbirth with a certain kind of reverence, but the realities of all those things are not very pretty. I think this is why a lot of times when women have to go into hospitals and stuff to have babies, they want to do this in a very sanitized kind of a way, even though, I'm sure it's not. It still can be a thing. Now people have C-sections and they get all kinds of episiotomies never mind, sorry. I'm just thinking of the epidural. Wrong E word. It's funny how I picked the other E word, right? Which is another horrible thing, episiotomy. But everything's very sanitized. We have to make it all very hygienic. And again, from a infectious disease perspective, we're trying to keep things as clean as possible. But again, there's this association that women and the things that are connected to women are somehow dirty, and maybe that also has to do with the way, part of the reason why we seem to think that this needs to be controlled. So anyway, so let's go back to our ideas here. Okay, so they're saying, to just go back to the last sentence here, she says excrement is never divine. This was not the case, however, in pre-Hispanic Mexico, where the human body and its products were not perceived as separate from and antithetical to the mind. Okay, so now she's bringing up the Cartesian mind-body split, right? I think, therefore I am, which was Rene Descartes' big error, I think. But yeah, the idea that somehow something of our mind is above our body. Even Plato, soma et sema, the body is a tomb. It's encasing this soul and this mind really, that wants to be free of the body that is so much lesser than it. So here we're talking about a situation where mind and body are not separated. Okay, we don't have this separation of the part of us that is conscious and thinks from the rest of us. That was the old brain in the vat that we used to talk about in philosophy class, but in any case. Okay, So it's not separate from the mind, social values, or the supernatural, and where metaphor tended to replace by metonym. There, excrement was conceived of as powerful and ambivalent, capable of signifying and causing not just bad but good as well. For this reason, excrement played an important role in certain visual and verbal discourses that helped Mexicans structure their relations to each other and to the simultaneously physical and spiritual world in which they lived. In ancient Mexico, the concept of divine excrement was not paradoxical, and excrement could indeed be divine. Okay, so they show different works of art here, and you actually do see deities here. Tlazolteotl actually is pictured with this little curl under her nose, which is actually a little curl of excrement. That is kind of like the decoration that she wears because she is said to eat excrement. And they are showing this one image here of a nearly naked man defecating, but seems to be eating some of his own excrement. And it passes into and wrapping around the cross-section of a neck jar containing a rabbit. And so what does the motif of a rabbit represent? Well, there seems to be this association. The rabbit god was primordial god of intoxicating beverages, who long ago broke the moon's face with a cup shaped like a rabbit. Thus, in these almanac scenes, the figure who is eating part of his own waste is apparently offering the remainder to the moon. And of course, the moon seems to be very heavily connected with this, and we'll get into why. It says, how do we explain such depictions? While these manuscripts were almost certainly painted in south-central Mexico during the century or two before the conquest, we know neither their exact provenance nor the language spoken by their makers. On the basis of what we know about the Aztecs of central Mexico, who by the time the conquest had expanded their control over a large part of Mexico, we can be fairly certain that the divinatory almanac scenes qualified the augury of the day by either illustrating the fate of one who transgressed in a particular way on that day or prescribing the rites that could offset that fate, or both. In the scenes before us, the targeted transgressions may have involved drunkenness, which, except on certain ritual occasions and for the elderly, was proscribed by Aztec law. So you're not allowed to. Drunkenness was not allowed. Violators of this proscription were severely punished, being said to have wallowed in order. So they may have literally been. Well, okay. So that's why it was prohibited. Since liquor, this kind of drunkenness were associated with rabbits and the moon, the figure of a man defecating on the moon may augur either the inadvisability of drinking or the fate of a person born on the day in question. But the depiction may warn of sexual licentiousness as well. Drunkenness was so closely associated with carnal vices, which themselves were represented in the erratic wanderings and the fecundity of the rabbit. Yeah, because we think about rabbits and their very prolific reproduction. Aztec sexual behavior was subject to legal restrictions, at least among the nobility, with female adultery, abortion, incest, and sodomy punishable by death. Most, if not all, of the numerous other Codex Borgia and Codex Vaticanus almanac scenes depicting excrement probably target just such transgressions, for among the various vices associated with excrement in Aztec times, excessive and misdirected sexual acts reigned paramount. Promiscuous women, for example, especially prostitutes and adulterers, as well as sodomites, were typically characterized in terms of body waste. Okay, so their vices were referred to, and there's the Aztec words, meaning filth, garbage, refuse, or order, with a strong excremental sense, in the words of Alfredo Lopez Austin. Okay, so supernatural patronage of all these asocial individuals was afforded by exclusively female deities, all of whom were associated with the moon. The most important was the goddess Tlazolteotl, whose name, although usually translated as goddess of filth, could also read as divine filth, even divine excrement. The name is based not on the word for excrement per se, but on a word literally meaning old, dirty, deteriorated, worn-out thing, which was used to connote filth, garbage, or refuse, all of which subsumed human waste products. Now, remember what I just said about Pombagira being kind of referred to as the Mary of garbage, right? There's this idea of this as being associated with this, and obviously associated with the moon, and then we obviously see a strong feminine association with that. So it says there's a codices that showed the goddess of filth holding a vase filled with a tiny person eating excrement, while another one, a manuscript believed to come from southeastern Mexico, a related goddess wears an ochre-colored curl, the generic sign for excrement, as her nose ornament. Tlazolteotl was also addressed by another name, which means eater of ordure, according to Thelma Sullivan. Sullivan accounts for the name by suggesting that Tlazolteotl was a goddess of the fertile earth that receives all organic wastes, human and animal excrement, and so forth, which when decomposed are transformed into humus, which is known as the earth filth and was associated with the revitalization of the soil. Yeah. So we're looking at another goddess here associated with decay. And decay, of course, is a dirty and process. If we think of, say, decomposing corpses and things like that, it's a decomposition is something definitely associated with impurity. But that decomposition produces something rich. It produces a manure that can be used to revitalize the earth. It's funny. I'm kind of doing this podcast. We have a rather snowy day, not really sticking so much, but since we are at the end of the season, a lot of the farms around us are putting down the manure to, in preparation for the next season. So you walk outside and it's very aromatic. When I walk outside, I was like, oh gosh, it's that time of year again. But the manure is there to help revitalize the richness of the soil. The bacteria and things in there are part of what re-enrich the earth and give the nutrients back. Now, which is why also it just makes me think of people who tend to be a bit hypochondrial when it comes to taking antibiotics. Like, oh, I've got a little bit of a sinus infection. I'd better run to the doctor and get some high-powered antibiotics. Well, if you continually remove all the germs from your body, like, blast those little mosquitoes with the flamethrower every single time, eventually you're not going to have an immune system left that's going to be able to, it's going to be reliant on these high-powered drugs, which will eventually not work. So, yeah, there's something to be said for the natural thing. The whole idea of immunity and vaccines and things like that is the idea that by infecting yourself with something, you actually, the infection is actually what allows you to be immune from receiving the disease. So if you think about that. And yeah, I know there's lots of anti-vax people out there. I know some people who are anti-vax, but really the reality has been since vaccines were invented, which was quite a long time ago. I want to say, maybe around the 1600s. Certainly they were used heavily in the American Revolution to stop smallpox. These inoculations, it's the idea that by taking in a part of this, that somehow you'll be protected from it. And yeah, I mean, a lot of these diseases are wiped out through vaccines. And I'm sorry if people who are anti-vax don't like that, but that is the truth. The idea, but I think sometimes the anti-vax stance also tends to come out of communities that are very much concerned, at least unconsciously, with purity. And so the idea of I'm not going to infect myself with that comes from this idea that somehow this quote unquote filth is not, has no benefit to us and has to be avoided or has to be killed off. The Aztecs had another word for soil fertilized with human excrement, and let me see if I can say it. Tlaloyak, I think is how you say it. I'm probably saying it totally wrong, and somebody I'm sure will correct me. Herbert Harvey suggests that this word alludes to the Aztec practice of collecting human excrement for use as fertilizer from public privies set up along the major roads. It is even possible that Tlazolteotl was a patroness of this fertilizer industry. Human excrement was also used in salt production as well as tanning. However, and thus it is significant that Sullivan relates Tlazolteotl to the salt goddess, whose name I'm not going to try to read. The close cognitive relation of urine to excrement is evident in the almanacs under discussion, where several of the defecating figures are simultaneously urinating. Note that urine, itself a metaphor for impurity, is salty, and suggested that the goddess of salt represented urine as well. Since the state also collected urine, which was used as a mordant in dyeing, it is not surprising that there was a separate word for soil that had been urinated upon. Among the Mixe today, or the Mixe, the myths also often represent urination as a fertilizing act compared to water or rainfall. The body wastes or filth associated with Tlazolteotl thus represent not just transgressions of the Aztec sexual code, but also the means for offsetting them, for transforming or converting them to something healthy and fertile. And yeah, this kind of gets back to what I was just saying about vaccines. This has to be the explanation for the curious name, and I'm not going to try to read this, eater of ordure, and of all almanac figures who consume their own excrement. Now, mind you, I should add here that I'm not suggesting that consuming your own excrement or drinking your own urine, although you will see people who will refer to that, is advisable. Okay, I'm not suggesting in any way, shape, or form that we should do that. Although you do find cultures that make use of these things. I think it was Sybil Leek who had been talking about her time in the New Forest with the travelers, the time that she had spent with them, and she had admired how long and strong their hair was, and she wanted to know what they used to do, and they were kind of very reluctant to tell her, and finally they said that they mixed whatever it was they used to wash their hair with, they mixed it with their own urine. And you do hear people who will talk about the health benefits of urine, but and I'm not here to tout those, but it's something that we typically don't think about because we always assume it's something filthy and infected, and or that it's going to bring infection or it's going to bring disease, which is interesting in its associations here. And thus, a goddess like Tlazolteotl is actually quite important because she's not only the one who creates the pollution, but she's also the one who takes it away. Yeah, so the body wastes or filth associated with Tlazolteotl thus represent not just the transgressions of the Aztec sexual code, but also the means for offsetting them, for transforming or converting them to something healthy and fertile. Okay, and I'm rereading this now, I'm realizing. Support comes from Bernardino de Sahagun's claim that Tlazolteotl was called this particular epithet as eater of ordure because she heard all confessions, she removed corruption. The Aztecs are well documented as having believed that a last-minute confession to this the goddess of one's sexual transgression could stave off the imminent threat of physical danger or death. Such penitents reportedly not only removed their clothes as to expose her to their evil odor, but swallowed their own stench, their own filth as well. There you go. They did this because an Aztec thought filth could be used to ward off or offset filth, restoring both moral and physical equilibrium. Now, again, that's probably... the truth of that is debatable. However, given what I've just said about reinfecting yourself as a means of avoiding infection, it's not entirely, even though it may seem illogical to us in a very dualistic way of thinking, it's not necessarily illogical. Again, not that I'm advocating that you do it. Excrement is thus not only embodied as the cause of an individual's bad health and potential demise, but also constitutes the mean to prevent or cure them. An anomalous substance therefore has both negative and positive connotations. This must be kept in mind in viewing manuscripts that were painted by acculturated natives after the Spanish conquest, often for Spanish church patrons where excrement is used exclusively as in Christian imagery to signify vice. So in these it says excrement here therefore surely represents female sexual transgressions, and they describe a picture that suggests that will be atoned for by shedding blood from self-inflicted wounds, which, okay, but that's a more Christianized version. We have seen, however, the strictly indigenous scheme of things to the real offerings to the moon goddess were lumps of excrement embodying the offenses themselves. The hope was that she would counteract the damage that the offenses had affected by literally consuming their material manifestation and converting them into fertilized humus. Okay, so yeah, there's this transformation, the transformation of the bad stuff into the good stuff, which is a little bit of a different idea than what we were talking about with the idea of vaccination. But there's this idea that what we excrete out in the same way that there's this kind of cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, that death is another stage of things, and that when our bodies decay, they become part of the earth, and they may become something else. We see a lot of Greek myths of resurrection, some of the original myths of death and resurrection, like the myth of Adonis, for example, or even the myth of Narcissus, where their death, when the blood from their bodies, comes back to the earth as a kind of flower. So. And all of Ovid's Metamorphoses actually is about, to some degree, the way in which that moment, there's a moment of transformation there. That's why it's called the metamorphosis, where one metamorphoses from being a living body to dying to the body becoming something else, or becoming the fertilizer for something else. And yeah, psychologically, we will often talk about that. Or spiritually. If you're working in spiritual coaching, a lot of times I do something called Rahani healing, and Rahani healing makes use of this concept known as what they call the violet flame. And what this concept does, and again, people who listen to this may or may not have any interest in that. But the idea is that it takes the things that block the heart, the things that wound us, and by visualizing it being transformed by that it kind of transforms it into something that allows us to release the toxic aspect of it and have it kind of be reused as something that we can use. So there's something alchemical about the way that that's supposed to work. And this is a concept that we have seen for forever. Like I said, we talked about the alchemists of kind of the medieval and kind of Renaissance periods, where the idea was that they were looking for the philosopher's stone, right? But really, it's this idea of transmuting base metals into gold, or using kind of excrement to be able to transfer into gold. And Jung has many essays on this in his writings on alchemy, in the way that this is how one might make that psychological journey to be able to integrate all of the experiences of our lives, not just the ones that we favor. So the other thing, so this article then goes on to talk about blindness, about another deity, and I'm not sure I'm going to say her name right, Ixnextli or something like that. I don't know. It's Ixnextli. You pronounce that as you will. That she's portrayed as crying, and that she is blind. Her name literally means ashes in the eyes. Her blindness was, according to a Catholic commentator, a punishment for having gathered flowers. That is excessive sexuality. I'm back to talking about flowers again, right? Throughout pre-Hispanic Mexico, the flower was indeed a metaphor for female sexuality and genitalia. Tlazolteotl, for example, is depicted in one codex with her naked body in frontal view and her legs widespread, a stylized flower emanating from her genital region. They talk about the idea that, we see this connection here. And it's interesting that blindness gets brought into the thing. Now, blindness can be something that's associated with venereal disease, as they mention here. I've talked frequently about blindness in Greek mythology as being something that takes away the outer sight so that one has internal sight. Whether that's really the inference here, it doesn't seem like there's much of an inference there having to do with that. But if you think about it too, like I think a lot of boys probably heard this, the idea that if you pleasure yourself, you're going to go blind. that's sort of probably where this idea sort of comes from. And so they were talking about the way in which venereal disease, the gods that had the power to cure as well as cause such diseases, and that oftentimes the medicine for venereal disease was urine or excrement. In the Judeo-Christian discourse, the apple that caused Eve's fateful fall into sin had no subsequent restorative powers comparable to those of excrement for the Aztecs. So in other words, by eating apples, you can't atone for your sins. Because again, this is what I mean when I talk about a non-dualistic system. This is not a system that makes a separation. I mean, yes, there obviously are laws and taboos forbidding certain things for obvious community and community standards and community hygiene. But there's also an understanding that this is part of human life and human existence. You can't pretend that these things don't exist. This is part and parcel, and it is only our certain aspects of ourselves that, there is the disease factor in trying to keep disease away from our body. This is where we have certain purifications. But at the same time, we tend to take that physical reality. And by the way, I guess I should say in the midst of that, before I even go there, is that the fact that there's these kinds of things in the physical body. I mean, so for example, having a period isn't a sign of a disease, okay? That's just a normal biological process when a woman is not pregnant. Even getting dirty outside is not necessarily going to mean you're going to get disease. And, one of the things that's often said about people who spend a lot of time looking after children, like they work in childcare or work with kids a lot, is that kids are sick all the freaking time. And they're sick all the time because they're exposed to each other and they're exposed to what everybody has. And it's that exposure to other kids and their things that allows somebody to build up an immune system. So really, being exposed to disease can bring strength. Similarly to psychologically, the old expression, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. I mean, the idea is that through our experiences, we are actually able to move into a space where we are, where we're able to be stronger, both in mind and body, which again, in this conception, are not separate things. And it's interesting because this really not only acknowledges the place of the feminine, acknowledges the reality of how disease could work. Because obviously, yes, if you have an open wound and you get something that's you get some kind of excrement or something. If people go into the water, okay, and if the water is not properly, like people have dumped sewage in the water, you can potentially get diseases from that. I mean, that's why we have sewage treatment plants and things. This is probably human excrement today. I don't know what it would have been like then, but certainly human excrement today is probably quite toxic. On the other hand, animal excrement, every time I go my sister and I go walking, we walk along this one trail that's near a farm that has Clydesdale horses, and frequently they will take the horses for a walk along this path. And so as we're walking around, there's literally piles of horse crap, like, everywhere. And you can see that they almost, as they decay, they start turning back into they look like hay. They look like what they've actually eaten. And of course, this kind of manure is actually considered to be good fertilizer, for things. But even the excrement of some of our pets and things is not considered to be healthy by today's standards. And I think a lot of this just has to do with the change in what we're eating and in what we're excreting out is not necessarily always beneficial to the system that we're in. And perhaps that's where the argument comes in for organics and things, but I don't think even modern organics, I don't even think that makes a difference. I just think the way that our bodies are and the way things have changed, that our excretions now, we've kind of, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. We decided that they were bad and they've become bad. But in any case, yeah, I mean, it's hard to decide whether or not in those times, whether or not truly this was a very good form of fertilizer. I imagine if it wasn't, then they wouldn't do it. They'd figure out after a while that this was not a good thing to do. But interesting how there's just like all facets of life are accepted. And, this aspect of what was considered the earth, the feminine in the sense of it being connected to the earth. And by the way, also to a certain degree to the underworld, because as we've said, that's the place where, under the earth is the place where treasure comes from. And of course, this is the stuff that as it decays, as it does in death, the waste products of the body, that it actually can have this revitalizing effect. Okay, so let me just read a little bit more for this, and then I'm going to probably wrap this up. So it says, sexual crimes were not entirely private matters. They were considered potentially harmful to society as a whole. And then there's a scene where there's an axe that appears where Tlazolteotl is holding an axe. It is a warning that if one does not rectify, that is, devour his sexual errors, he can expect to have them forcibly excised. So there they're talking about the idea of disembowelment, which we won't get into because that will be it's another very not pleasant subject. I imagine if anybody's like having dinner while listening to this podcast, might not exactly give you the best images here. So in any case, she gets into the importance of intestines and stuff in these kinds of sacrifices and things like that. And then she says, okay, so jumping ahead, excrement was therefore invested through metonymy with real power. It was more than a mere metaphor for certain odious acts. This may explain why the infuriated Aztecs destroyed an altar fouled by excrement placed there by their enemies, and why their enemies threw excrement at them in battle. For excrement was associated with both immaturity and death in Mesoamerica. And think about it. Well, we think about Freud's different stages of development, and the anal is certainly one of them, where children can get fascinated with, what's in their diapers. But immaturity too, if we also think about, monkeys flinging feces at each other and so forth, or a way that we use that as a metaphor for, I don't know, political discourse and political ads, the way people fling feces at each other, figuratively speaking. So could reduce warriors to infancy, thereby weakening and even killing them. The land of the dead, which was located deep beneath the earth's surface in the underworld, was conceived of as the bowels of the earth. Yeah, think about that. The bowels of Mother Earth. The intestines of the personified earth, where, according to Sahagun, the place will be made excrement. But this power, as we have seen, can be positive as well as negative. For what had the power to disrupt health and harmony also had the power to restore them. This is nowhere better illustrated in the Aztec perception of gems and minerals as excrement. Mica and later lead, for example, were identified as the moon's excrement, while gold was called, again, there's another word I'm not going to be able to pronounce, yellow sacred excrement, and then also the excrement of the sun. The sun was a god. The sun god, and gold represented the traces of the body waste that he deposited during the night as he passed through the underworld. Again, similar to the Egyptian in the sense that the sun god passes through the underworld at night, which is interesting. Sahagun's informants explain that sometimes in places it appears the dawn something like a little bit of diarrhea, which is very yellow, very wonderful, and is called the sun's excrement because it is good, fine, and precious. There's an interesting image for you. Gold was thus the most precious metal in ancient Mexico, being elaborately worked into a variety of highly valued elite items. Gold dust stored in quills, moreover, served to standardize the currencies used in market transactions and was also used for medicinal purposes. In particular, gold in the form of dust or filings was literally eaten by patients with skin pustules or hemorrhoids, which we have seen were attributed to sexual vice. Pustules were sometimes called, okay, I'm not going to try that. They had different names for them, let's put it that way. And the use of gold, both to prevent and cure symptoms, were related to the Aztec legend of the mythical figure Nanuatzin, according to Celer, a god of syphilis, who is represented by figures in the Codex Borgia as having twisted hands and feet. Okay, so the importance of this god connected to syphilis stemmed from his humble actions during the dark days of creation when the gods had gathered to find some way to light the universe. Unlike the other gods, he had no incense to offer. He burned his own scabs and instead immolated himself in order to rise as the sun. So therefore, gold dust could be effective against sexually caused diseases, then precisely because it represented the excrement of the sun. From the moment of the Spanish conquest, which was motivated by a desire for gold, significance of the metal became ambivalent in Mexico. For although, as noted, it was the leader of all riches on earth, that which is sought, that which is cherished, it became, for that reason, became an instrument of torment, a deadly thing that was also a deceiver. Now, this is the last point I did want to make. Deception here seems to refer to immoral means of acquiring wealth and power because the quote-unquote deadly thing was further identified as the property of the lords and the ruler. An Aztec man who through deception grew rich, like a ruler, was described as filthy. Thus, the word for excrement could also be used to signify excess or greed, with the added connotations of laziness and soft tissues. The direct reference appears to be to overeating, which would have violated Aztec codes of moderation. But the emphasis here is on the link between gold and torment may well reflect the historical realities of native experience during the conquest and its aftermath. Yeah, because when gold is sought after for a different reason, here gold is considered to be, they're calling it the excrement of the sun. It's interesting how we have some things like that. Like I think in Greek, amber, the actual amber is actually considered to be sunlight that is trapped in a rock. Okay, we have this idea of the sun as creating these things, and of course, if the sun has this nourishing and curative and life-giving power, then obviously anything that represented the byproducts of the sun would be healthy here. But it's interesting that there's a connection here with deception as well, because here we go. The dialectic is clearly rooted in indigenous beliefs about excrement. For excrement, as we have seen, could be a deadly thing symbolic of deception. Moreover, it served as a metaphor for poverty and low social status. A member of the lowest class was called Tlactli, from Tlaco, to corrupt, to sin, to do evil. The name reveals that, like illness, poverty, and powerlessness, were attributed to immoral acts. Okay, yeah, and that gets back to the idea that our lot in life is somehow connected to our actions, which is actually not true. But certainly by the time we get to times in Mexico where you have these conquerors, and you have the conquest, and of course you have this coming of Christianity. And now again, whether or not that was also part of the original Aztec way of thinking, that I'm not totally clear on, but it definitely falls into that more dualistic way of thinking. And actually, to me, though, there's nothing really terribly Christian about it at all. If you really think about what Christianity is supposed to be as a religion, because the idea is that you are supposed to, the poor are blessed in some way, but in this they're not. And that idea has actually persisted, especially in these kinds of political Christian kinds of, or colonial kinds of conceptions of it that suggests that one's poverty and powerlessness therefore implies that there's something corrupt about you, when it's usually the other way around. Members of this group were legally and contractually obliged to serve others in debt for payment of their errors, and if uncooperative, could be collared and sold for sacrifice in the market. Their condition, like that of all commoners and laborers, was equated with dung. And to be free of slavery was to throw away excrement. Significantly, if such a slave was declared legally free, if he could escape his master in the marketplace, and having made it beyond its limits, managed to step on a pile of human excrement. There's simply no parallel to this restorative, positive meaning of human waste in Western institutional, social, and religious practice. Yeah, by experiencing the taboo thing, he is somehow free. And I think that's it. The idea there's a lot of talk about the ways in which the various taboos that we have, that when one engages in the taboos, and this is sometimes part of these secret rituals or magical rituals, although again, there has been discussion about how many taboos are really left, but that the violation of a taboo puts you not only outside the human community, it kind of makes you magical almost in a way. So the idea that if somebody who was considered to be quote unquote excrement steps in a pile of human excrement, then they become free in some way, which is interesting. So there's simply no parallel because in Western institutional, social, and religious practice in ancient Mexico, dung did not merely symbolize unpleasantness and opprobrious things and conditions in steady opposition to the good and spiritual. In Mexico, in contrast to Euro-America, dung was never trivial. Among the Aztecs, at least, excrement's importance may derive in part from its role in nourishment or from fear of the occasional famines that plagued central Mexico, as well as the dysentery and diarrhea endemics at the time of conquest. Yeah, actually, they call it Montezuma's Revenge, is like another... It makes me think about that, because people who drink water in certain places and then end up with either dysentery or diarrhea. But the multivalence of the symbol, like its wide geographic distribution and its embeddedness in an entire moral code, further indicates a fundamental cognitive function. For throughout ancient Mexico, excrement worked as a metonym of the gods and of the sun and the moon to help structure and reinforce social values in binary terms drawn from the forms and processes of the human body. Social behavior was thus channeled and controlled through an ideology where feces articulated the undesirability of excess and indulgence as opposed to abstinence and self-sacrifice, of deception, metaphorized as blindness, as opposed to honor expressed as vision, of sickness and death as opposed to good health and long life, and of poverty and powerless versus wealth and rulership. In Mexico, in other words, the expression holy shit would have had no surprise value because it would have not contained a paradox. Excrement, the symbol par excellence of immortality and its undesirable physical and social consequences, immorality, not immortality, and its undesirable physical and social consequences was ambivalent and as such could be divine as well. So, interesting. Now, again, I am not as versed enough in the Aztec to know. I'm assuming the scholarship here is sound, but I would suggest that a lot of, obviously, the aversion we have to excrement, the aversion that we have to the byproducts of the body, are similar to the aversion we might have to a corpse, and to other certain practices that are just that seem repellent to us. Cannibalism, for example. These acts are frequently repellent, but what a goddess like Tlazolteotl tells us, or can really show us, is first of all, it expresses a reality about life. A lot of times we want to paint over, whitewash, sanitize our image of life and of the way that it is. We may have this very romanticized version of how things are, but this is kind of the stark reality that we see here of how things are. And within the stark reality of how things are, the fact that they're not always pretty, that they don't always, smell beautifully, that they don't, that they are, that in addition to whatever sweet things there may be about the human body, there's also things that are foul, that smell foul, that that are considered to be dirty, and that can be connected with disease, or the bringing of disease if they are not removed. At the same time, we're seeing here that there's this lack of separation between polluting, the polluter and the purifier. Right? There's this lack of separation, and there's an understanding that this is, even though there may be injunctions against it, because if your goal is to keep order in a society, then obviously things that might disrupt that order, which might cause chaos, which might cause a spread of disease, or might bring about, for whatever reason, it might create an imbalance. If it's the job of the king or the ruler or the ruling party to keep balance, then certainly you're going to have these taboos and injunctions. But also through the taboo and injunction, there's also a means of remedying the taboo and injunction. So it's not as though. So I just think it's interesting the kind of awareness there that what is frequently considered to be, whereas we tend to look at things as it's either what's pure is good, what's impure is bad, and should be exorcised, should be gotten rid of. This gets back to the idea that I've talked about, that what is considered to be unpleasant, or what is considered to be that things that we might consider to be sources of infection or sources of different things may also, in their own way, be the way through, be the way to rectify what we have, whatever misfortune or whatever illness has befallen us. And I don't want to get into the whole hygienic aspects of this because, as I've said, I mean, there's a lot of reasons why you don't necessarily want to make use of these kinds of things, unless you are coming from some kind of culture that is very well versed in how to use them properly. I don't know that we are, and I don't know that we live in a system that's healthy enough to reuse those products. I can't talk to the science of that, right? But at the same time, it does remind us, at least on a psychological level, that oftentimes the things that we feel are shortcomings, are stains, are flaws, that they may actually be the things that are, I don't want to say redeeming, because I'm not the type of person who thinks that human needs to be redeemed. I don't follow the savior idea that I need to be saved from something. I think it's a matter of, first of all, full acceptance of what it means to be human, full acceptance of all aspects of everything about life, both the things that we consider beautiful and aesthetic and the things that maybe are not so much, that are more debauched or filthy. And again, not the idea that you want to fall excessively into that, which is why you have these taboos and you have these limitations and these boundaries that are set. But at the same time, there has to be recognition that these things are also part of the creation. They're part of the world. Just as death is part of life, illness is part of life. The byproducts of of eating are part of life. And our association with that, and they could be, in some ways, they can be something that we can use to, I don't know, to find a way to the gold, to find a way to the treasure, might be through those things that we have deemed unhealthy, immoral, or that which needs to be exterminated. It goes back to Nietzsche's saying, that be careful that when you exorcise your demons that you don't remove the worst part of yourself. Sorry, I said that wrong. That you don't remove the best part of yourself. That was an interesting slip. But that you're not exorcising the best part of yourself, because if all aspects of us are part of the system of who we are. The toxic is woven in with the pure, and how do we look at that, and how do we step back, and how do we integrate that? How do we figure that in? So I don't know, interesting, goddess, and thank you to whoever had suggested. I mean, it's been a while, so I don't quite remember. I know it was a YouTube recommendation. I hope this podcast was enlightening. It's certainly an interesting topic, but definitely gets to that idea that every aspect of life is sacred, and needs to be accorded its proper respect or means of working with it. So thank you so much for listening. If you do enjoy these podcasts and you are not subscribed, please subscribe if you're on audio. I'm on Spreaker, or you can subscribe on any podcast app that you have if you're not subscribed already. On YouTube, if you could subscribe to the Chthonia channel, that would be extremely helpful. As the more subscribers that I have, I tend to be getting sort of like 70 or 80 a month, and so it's kind of still growing very, very slowly. And I don't know, I guess it depends on where people are getting it. If you want to support my work is featured on patreon.com/Chthonia, where I also provide extra podcasts. I send out swag and take requests, and also offer free classes and things to people who are on Patreon. So if you care to join the community there, obviously you'd be most welcome. Follow me on social media at Chthonia Podcast, one word. I am on Blue Sky now, so I've not really done anything with it yet, but I did move over to there. I did get rid of X, and I'm also on Instagram and Facebook still, Chthonia Podcast. Really, you can do at Chthonia Podcast in either of those places, and on YouTube to find me. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.